This was an amazing conference. I thank everybody. Thank the bishop, thank Father Casey, thank all of you who came to it, and all of you anonymous souls who did the invisible work, like the Holy Spirit. It's ironic that I end with Dorothy Sayers because that's where I began. She was the first Inkling that I discovered. I was just a high school student browsing in a bookstore, saw a book called Creed or Chaos, was intrigued by the title, bought it, started reading it, got hooked. So I remember going to my pastor. I was in the Dutch Reformed Church then, and Reverend Jansma, who was a wonderful man, had taught catechism and encouraged questioning. And I said, have you heard of Dorothy Sayers? I just read her book. And his eyes lit up, and he said, oh, you discovered Dorothy Sayers, wonderful. Someday you'll discover C.S. Lewis, too. I said, who's he? Well, that was my entrance. Different things attract different people in authors. One of the things that attracted me to Dorothy Sayers was her sense of humor. Because in my Calvinist experience, Calvinists, though very good and honorable and intelligent people, tend to be sort of like Stoics. They sort of lack a sense of humor. So when I read her satirical stuff, I said, oh, this is almost as good as Hilaire Belloc. For instance, the Creed of Saint Euthanasia. I believe in man, maker of himself and inventor of all science, and in myself, his manifestation and captain of my psyche, and that I should not suffer anything painful or unpleasant. I believe in a vague evolving deity, the future begotten child of man, conceived by the spirit of progress, born of emergent variation, who shall kick down the ladder by which he rose and tell history to go to hell. Who shall someday take off from earth and be jet-propelled into the heavens and sit exalted above all worlds, man the Master Almighty. And I believe in the spirit of progress, who spake by Shaw and the Fabians, and in a modern administrative, ethical, and social organization, in the isolation of saints, in the treatment of complexes, in joy through health, in the destruction of the body by cremation, and then I've had it. A sense of humor is very significant. There are two kinds. There are senses of humor that are like oases from the real world, and then there are senses of humor that reveal the real world. They're not like jokes, comic relief. They're inherent in the story. And I've always thought, deep down, although I was hesitant for a long time to express this because it seemed kind of irreligious or even blasphemous, that Christianity was the funniest religion in the world. From the devil's point of view, God certainly does not sit on his dignity. The incarnation was the greatest joke ever played. And I found that Dorothy Sayers and the other Inklings, and through them I discovered also G.K. Chesterton, who I think is one of the most brilliant minds who ever lived, understood that profoundly. So I'd like to go through one book, Creed or Chaos, and pick out a few big ideas, just a few, because that's all we remember anyway. A brilliantly organized lecture which totally and clearly defines 50 ideas and relates them in a logical order is very impressive while it lasts, but when you go home you don't remember it, except how brilliant the lecturer was. But if he just concentrates on a few big ideas, they can change your life. So I want to pick out 9 big ideas from Creed or Chaos, actually 8 from that book and 1 from another. And since Creed or Chaos is, as far as I know, out of print, I will be reading from an anthology called Christian Letters to a Post-Christian World, which I think is still in print, although I'm not sure. And the first one is the tithe of the church. And if we think it dull, it is because we have either never really read those amazing documents or have recited them so often and mechanically to have lost all sense of their meaning. The plot pivots upon a single character, and the whole action is the answer to a single central question: what think ye of Christ? Before we adopt any of the unofficial solutions, some of which are indeed excessively dull, Before we dismiss Christ as a myth or an idealist or a demagogue or a liar or a lunatic, it might do no harm to find out what the creeds really say about him. What does the church think of Christ? The church's answer is categorical and uncompromising. It is that Jesus bar Joseph, the carpenter of Nazareth, was in fact and in truth and in the most exact and literal sense of the word, the God by whom all things were made. I recall the very first page of Pope John Paul II's book on Jesus, where he refers to a dialogue with his very good Jewish friend, Rabbi Klausner. And the rabbi asks, yes, of course, Jesus was an admirable person and probably a great prophet and a great philosopher, but what did he leave? What did he give us? How did he change history? After he left, people died, people suffered, people sinned, people warred, didn't seem to give us anything we didn't have before. And the Pope said, well, the answer is very simple. He gave us God. Oh, how could we not see that? His personality, she says, was the personality of God, insofar as that personality could be expressed in human terms. The man we hanged was God Almighty. And this is the dogma we find dull, the terrifying drama of which God is the victim as well as the hero. Chesterton says somewhere that Christianity is the only religion in the world that has added courage to the virtues of the divine nature or the divine person. If this is dull, then what in heaven's name is worthy to be called exciting? The people who hanged Christ never, to do them justice, accused him of being a bore. On the contrary, they thought him much too dynamic to be safe. It's fascinating that if you read the Gospels, you find a word occurring over and over again. There are not too many psychological words in the Gospels. That is, the psychological reaction of Jesus, of the apostles, of his enemies, of all the characters, is not front and center. It's not a typically modern document in that way. It's a typically ancient document. He said this, he did this, this happened. You, of course, do feel how the people felt in his presence, but the authors don't tell you how to feel. In other words, they're good writers. But there is one word that describes a psychological state of mind that's used perhaps more often than any other. And it's used of both his enemies and his friends and those who can't decide whether they should be his enemies or his friends, but who, since they were reasonable and sane people, unlike some modern theologians, realized that they had to choose between one or the other. The word is thauma, or thaumadzane, which is usually translated wonder, or amazement, or astonishment, discombobulation. Jesus was literally the only person in the history of the world who never once bored anybody, except maybe King Herod, which tells us more about Herod than about Christ. On the contrary, they thought him too dynamic to be safe. It has been left for later generations to muffle that shattering personality, to surround him with an atmosphere of tedium. We have very efficiently pared the claws of the Lion of Judah, certified him meek and mild, and recommended him as a fitting household pet for pale curates and pious old ladies. What an insult to both curates and pious old ladies. If he really was both God and man, then when the man, Jesus, died, God died. And when God rose from the dead, man rose too, because they were one. Now, if we're going to disbelieve a thing, it seems on the whole to be desirable that we should first find out what exactly we are disbelieving. How sane. But sanity is taken for granted far too often. One of my favorite books of theology is Frank Sheed's Theology and Sanity. Brilliant, clear, perhaps the best description of the doctrine of the Trinity for beginners that I've ever read. And his other book, Society and Sanity, is equally sane. I'm going to say something about that in connection with Sayers in a few moments. We may call this divine revelation, or we may call it rubbish. But if we call it dull, our words have no meaning at all. That God should play the tyrant over man is a dismal story of unrelieved oppression, but that man should play the tyrant over, and that man should play the tyrant over man is the usual dreary record of human futility, but that man should play the tyrant over God is an astonishing drama indeed. Any journalist hearing of this for the first time would recognize it as news. Those who did hear it for the first time actually called it news, the good news, though we are apt to forget that the word gospel ever meant anything so sensational. One's basic fundamental attitude towards everything, towards a thing, colors every other reaction that we have. Intellectual, moral, emotional. There's a category in the Bible and in St. Augustine, the heart, which has a kind of mystical meaning. Sometimes it simply means the seat of emotions. And some emotions are specifically human, some we share with the animals. And sometimes it's a synonym for the word will. But at other times, it's more mystical than that. It's a word that designates the absolute center of a person from which everything else flows, including the intellect and the will and the emotions, all of which are objectifiable and specifiable and definable functions which are distinct from each other, like branches on a tree. But the heart is the very trunk of the tree. And these fundamental attitudes come from the heart. And if our fundamental attitude towards Christianity is boredom, then no matter how brilliant you are and how moral you are and how interesting your emotions are, you will fundamentally misunderstand it. I didn't understand all that at the first time I read Dorothy Sayers consciously, but I did unconsciously. So I said, she's onto something. A second big idea, which she shares with the other Inklings very well, especially with C.S. Lewis, is her negative apologetics, her critique of modernity, especially as modernity has seeped into Christendom in the form of a kind of liberal or modernist or naturalist theology. Here is her brilliant critique of the optimistic futurism of typical liberal theology. Such men, she says, finding no value for the world as it is, proclaim loudly their faith in the future. They say, it is in the hands of the young. With this flattery, they bind their own burden on the shoulders of the next generation. For their own failures, time alone is to blame, not sin, which is expiable, but time, which is irreparable. From the relentless reality of age, they seek escape into a fantasy of youth, their own or other people's. First love, boyhood ideals, childish dreams, the song at the mother's breast, the blind security of the womb. From these, they construct a monstrous fabric of pretense to be their hiding place from the tempest. Their faith is not really in the future, but in the past. Paradoxical as it may seem, to believe in youth is to look backward. To look forward, we must believe in age. A paradox truly worthy of Chesterton. Christ said, except ye become as little children. And the words are sometimes quoted to justify the flight into infantilism. Now, children differ in many ways, but they have one thing in common. All normal children look forward to growing up. Okay, that's a genuine oops. One of the great differences between Orthodox Christian theology and liberal modernist revisionist Christian theology is this question of boredom. The first may indeed be a horrible, oppressive, mythological construct, but it's not boring. And the second may indeed be a reasonable and scientific and enlightened and progressive idea, but it's a crashing bore. It's Mr. Rogers' neighborhood instead of the church militant. It's the church mumbling. Somehow or other, she says, and with the best intentions, we have shown the world, the typical Christian, in the likeness of a crashing bore. And this in the name of one who assuredly never bored a soul in those 33 years during which he passed through the world like a flame. That's very significant. Everybody wondered at Christ. Everybody was amazed at him. Friends, enemies, agnostics. Is there any other human being in the history of the world who never bored anybody? Now, this, to me, is much more important than most people think. Boredom, Walker Percy points out in Lost in the Cosmos, which is, I think, just about the funniest book of philosophy anybody has ever written. Highly recommended. Percy points out that the very word boredom does not exist in ancient languages. That is, generalized boredom. I'm just bored, not bored with cutting wood or bored with tilling the ground, but I'm just bored. That's very significant. It's equally significant that there is only one person who ever lived that nobody can write good stories about. You can write good stories about fictional people like King Arthur or Martians. You can write good stories about historical people like Napoleon or Julius Caesar, but you cannot write good stories about Jesus. Evangelicals try to, and they succeed in showing that it's impossible because they're all embarrassingly bad. Really, really bad. It's impossible. You can't do it. Nobody has ever done it. Nobody ever will do it. The real figure in the Gospels is so big that all our versions of him are laughably tiny in comparison. Now that proves something. You have to have something of the imaginative mind and the intuitive mind of a writer or reader of good stories to understand that, but most people have that kind of a mind, unless they've been corrupted by years at Harvard or MIT. And that's impressive. The only two totally successful fictional portraits of Jesus that I know of in all of human history are, first of all, the one that Dostoevsky paints in the famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor, in which Jesus utters not a word, and performs no action except one. After the Inquisitor is all over and has brilliantly depicted who Jesus is and what he's all about, without Jesus doing anything, Jesus simply leans over and kisses him. Absolutely brilliant. The other one is, I think, what future generations, maybe even thousands of years from now, will still remember C.S. Lewis for as his greatest achievement. Aslan. Many children wrote letters to C.S. Lewis saying some version of this question. Mr. Lewis, I go to Sunday school and I'm a Christian, but I love Aslan more than I love Jesus. Is that bad? And of course, Lewis said, of course not. Aslan is Jesus, as he might have appeared in another world. It's not an allegory. It's an imagination. But what Lewis enabled you to do was to spontaneously feel towards Aslan the way that those who met the real Jesus spontaneously felt towards Jesus. That kind of frisson, that kind of I don't know what the noun is, but when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, when you stop breathing for a minute, when you say, I never saw that before. The combination of standstill shock and fiery dynamic passion at the same time. The wonder, the thelma. He did it. I should modify my remarks by saying that there's some fairly decent Jesus fiction around. That's rare. Anne Rice wrote 2 good books about that during her Christian phase. I don't know what happened to her after that. But Very, very rare. All right, there's two big ideas. Here's a third one. We've talked about Christianity as drama. That's our first big idea. We've talked about Christianity as dogma rather than modernist uplift. That's our second big idea. Now, the third big idea is to identify the first two. The dogma is the drama, she says in the title of one of her essays. Christ, in his divine innocence, said to the woman of Samaria, "You worship you know not what," being apparently under the impression that it might be desirable on the whole to know what one was worshiping. He thus showed himself sadly out of touch with the 20th century mind, for the cry today is, "Away with the tedious complexities of dogma, let us have the simple spirit of worship, just worship no matter of what." The only drawback to this demand for generalized and undirected worship is the practical difficulty of arousing any sort of enthusiasm for the worship of nothing in particular. The newspapers don't make many headlines about everything in general and nothing in particular. Chesterton brilliantly criticizes Nietzsche, the worshiper of will and passion, for saying, in effect, "I don't care what you will, just will something." In other words, I have no will in the matter. That's boring. There's a passage in Creed or Chaos, which was not reproduced in this anthology, so I can't find it here, where she goes through all the major Christological heresies of the first 6 ecumenical councils and finds that they're amazingly relevant to modern problems. They're not old historical, dusty curiosities at all. You can label almost every modern heretic either an Arian or an Apollonian or a monophysite or something like that. It's a tour de force. Fourth big idea. The atheist's major argument against God is always the problem of evil, by which the atheist never means sin, but always suffering. All right, there are two problems of evil, really. The problem of sin, which is much more serious, and the problem of suffering. But fortunately, the most serious form of evil, sin, is easily explainable. Look in the mirror. The other one is much more difficult. What does she do with this? She writes, "The creative will presses on to its end, capital I," so she knows she's talking about God's will, "regardless of what it must suffer, by the way. It does not choose suffering, but it will not avoid it, and must expect it, given the character of man and his world. We say that it is love, and we say that it sacrifices itself for what it loves. And this is true, provided we understand what we mean by sacrifice. Sacrifice is what it looks like to other people, but to that which loves, I think, it does not appear so. When one really cares, the self is forgotten, and the sacrifice becomes only a part of its activity. Ask yourself, if there is something you supremely love and want to do you count as self-sacrifice all the difficulties encountered, or the other possible activities that you must cast aside? No, you do not. The time when you deliberately say, I must sacrifice this or that or the other thing, is only when you do not supremely desire your primary end in view. At such times, you are doing your duty, and this is admirable, but it is not love. Love is total. What a freeing thing it is that Jesus says you must love the Lord your God with all your heart. We think of that as oppressive. It's impossible. It gives us a guilt complex. No, it's just the opposite. It frees you. Because there's nothing left. Try to give God 90% or even 10%, and you'll be oppressed, and you'll be unfree, and you'll be arguing about the additional 1 or 2%. Give him everything, and there's nothing to argue about. That's what love is. We've already lost one hemisphere and we're going south. The global south is the future. She wrote this in the 50s. The reason why the churches are discredited today is not that they are bigoted about theology, but that they have run away from theology. The Church of Rome alone has retained her prestige because she puts theology in the foreground of her teachings. She's speaking more about Protestant Episcopalianism than about Anglicanism, I suppose. If Christian dogma is irrelevant to life, then to what in heaven's name is it relevant? Since religious dogma is in fact nothing but a statement of doctrines concerning the nature of life and the real world. The central dogma of the Incarnation, which, by the way, is the one very clear and very distinct line in the sand that sharply and totally separates Christianity from all other religions of the world, no matter how many profound unities there are. Because if you believe that this man, Jesus Christ, is the Son of God, and fully divine as well as fully human, you are a Christian. And if you do not believe that, you are not a Christian. Now, many people are Christians who don't call themselves Christians because they don't profess adherence to a specific Christian creed or denomination, but they believe that about Jesus. And many people who call themselves Christians don't believe that about Jesus, so they aren't Christians. But that's an either-or. The central dogma of the Incarnation is that by which relevance stands or falls. If Christ was only man, then he is entirely irrelevant to thoughts about God. If he is only God, then he is entirely irrelevant to thoughts about man. It is, in the strictest sense, necessary to the salvation of relevance that one should believe rightly in the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ. And unless he believes rightly, there's not the faintest reason why he should believe at all. Another big idea, I think this is number 6. I'm bad about both mathematics and memory. Did I get to 5 or only to 4? It doesn't matter. Is a realism about sin. Here is a striking sentence. Sayre frequently has these Chestertonian paradoxes which stand everything on their head until you realize that they do exactly the opposite, that the world is standing on its head and it's putting things right side up. Where she says, one of the greatest sources of strength of Christianity today lies in the profoundly pessimistic view it takes of human nature. Hurrah for pessimism. The people who are most discouraged and despairing and despondent because of the barbarity and stupidity of human behavior at this time are those who think highly of Homo sapiens as a product of evolution and who still cling to an optimistic belief in the civilizing influence of progress and enlightenment. If you believe in sin, you can be an optimist. Hey, for desperate sinners, we're doing pretty well. But if you don't believe in sin, you have to be a horrible pessimist. Presented as something imposed upon a man from without, not created by him from within. The dreadful conclusion follows inevitably that he is not responsible for evil and therefore cannot alter it. No hope. What a compliment to call a man a sinner. Today, if we could really be persuaded that we are miserable sinners, that the trouble is not outside us but inside us, and that therefore, by the grace of God, we can do something to put it right, if we believed that, we would receive that message as the most hopeful and heartening thing that can be imagined. Unbelievers often see that point better than Christians do. For instance, John Steinbeck, in his semi-autobiographical journal, Travels with Charlie, he's on the road, and he's on the outs, and he's kind of, not a nice, optimistic, helpful, hopeful, socially forward-looking person. And Charlie is his mangy dog. that he talks to. He likes Charlie better than people. And somewhere in that book, there's a story of he's going through the South, and it's Sunday morning. He hasn't been to church for many years. He's an agnostic at best, an atheist at worst. And he hears a Baptist white clapboard church, people singing hymns. He says, I'll go in. So he sits down just in time for the sermon. And the sermon is a fire and brimstone sermon from the preacher. You're miserable sinners. And he sits there and smiles, doesn't say anything. His dog is with him. And afterwards, doesn't say anything to anybody else. He goes out and sits on a bench and talks to Charlie. He said, Charlie, if I had the guts, I'd go up to that preacher and I'd give him my glad hand and say, thank you, preacher. You made me feel better than I felt in 20 years. What a compliment. You called me a sinner. Nobody called me that before. God must think I'm pretty important. A seventh idea. She's written quite a bit about this. It's about work, the theology of work. One of her best dramas, I think, is The Zeal of Thy House. It's taking place in the Middle Ages, and it's about building a cathedral. And the main theme of it is that it's the worker that is for the work, not vice versa. It's the good part of the theme of an otherwise bad book, namely The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. If you ever read that, you probably felt two things about it. This is very unchristian and selfish and proud and arrogant, but on the other hand, there's something right about it. And Dorothy Sayers gets what's right. Here's what she says about work. The unsacramental attitude of modern society to man and matter is probably closely connected with its unsacramental attitude towards work. The modern tendency seems to be to identify work with gainful employment. And this is, I maintain, the essential heresy at the back of the great economic fallacy which allows wheat and coffee to be burned and fish to be used for manure while whole populations stand in need of food. The result of the work is thought to be a mere byproduct. The aim of the work is to make money, to do something else. Doctors practice medicine not primarily to relieve suffering, but to make a living. The cure of the patient is something that has to happen as a means to that end. But a medieval guild insisted not only on the employer's duty to his workmen, but also on the laborer's duty to his work. But we cannot expect a sacramental attitude to work while many people are forced by our evil standard of values to do work which is a spiritual degradation. A long series of financial trickeries, for example, or the manufacture of vulgar and useless trivialities. You find in the papal encyclicals about society and especially work this fundamental point, which is rediscovered in the modern world because truths are rediscovered only when they're denied by heresies. That's why God allows heresies. An eighth point. Another, let's say, typically modern heresy is a wrong notion of society, and that elicits a profounder reflection on the nature of society, which is neither autonomous individualism nor a kind of quasi-totalitarian collectivism. About this, she writes, it is impossible to have a Christian doctrine of society except as a corollary to Christian dogma about the Trinity book to get you thinking about the relationship between aesthetics on the one hand and Christian dogma, especially the Trinity, on the other hand. Two topics that we rarely connect together. In fact, in the modern world, our typical attitude towards the whole realm of beauty and the beautiful and the arts is that the artist is supposed to be a rebel. He's supposed to be a social outcast. He's supposed to live in a Coldwater, East Greenwich Village flats, go insane and cut his ear off and send it to his girlfriend, or eat rats and starve. That's something new. In ancient Athens, if you were a good enough artist, you got free room and board in the town hall for the rest of your life. And the town hall was right in the middle of town, not out in nowhere. We have taken our notion of art and reduced it to, maybe a kind of soporific or a kind of aspirin to relieve the sufferings of real life. She takes it much more seriously than that. She said, "It is very odd that we do not today have a Christian aesthetic, a Christian philosophy of the arts." And her call for that and her realization that this is very important is an early version of something that many others have seen. Von Balthasar, for instance, or Solzhenitsyn. There's a lot of things I could say about this. Let me just say one thing. She starts by taking Plato very seriously. If you read the Church Fathers, you will be shocked by the fact that they take quite seriously the thing that almost every modern reader dislikes in Plato, namely his attitude towards the arts in the Republic. It's very censorial and apparently very Puritan. Artists are not allowed in the state unless they're moralistic artists. Realistic artists are not allowed. They're harmful. But she tries to rehabilitate, or half-rehabilitate Plato, not for the sake of historical accuracy or even for the sake of Plato, but for a deeper purpose, as we'll see in a moment. She says, "What Plato is really concerned to banish from his perfect state is the kind of art which aims at mere entertainment, which he saw as art that dissipates energy instead of directing it into some good and useful channel. Plato is concerned with the moral and human effect of art." And so far, so good. Plato lived at the beginning of the era which saw the collapse and corruption of the great Greek civilization. Plato saw the rot beginning to settle in and cried out like a prophet to his people to repent while there is yet time. He saw that the theater audience was in fact looking to the theater for nothing but amusement and entertainment, frittering themselves away. Well, there is an ominous likeness between the decadence of Plato's age and that of ours. It may be well for us to remember Plato's warning, "If you receive the pleasure-seasoned muse, pleasure will be the king in your city instead of law and principle." The remedy Plato proposes is first to get rid of representational art, which he hoped would take away the frittering pleasure and entertainment, and then to introduce a kind of moralistic art, which is sort of a social propaganda, which is, of course, what the fascists and communists and all totalitarians have tried to do. So he got part of the problem right, but he didn't get the solution right. The fundamental mistake here is a division of art into only two different kinds. First, entertainment art, which dissipates the energies of the audience and pours them down the drain, and then the other kind of art, which canalizes energy into a sort of mill stream to turn the wheel of social action. What's missing? A third category, the most important one of all. Where did that come from? It came from Christian dogma. Huh? The idea of art as creation is the single most important contribution that Christianity has made to aesthetics. Unfortunately, we are apt to use the words creation and creativeness very vaguely and loosely because we do not relate them properly to their theological basis. But it is significant that the Greeks did not have this word in their aesthetic at all. They looked on a work of art as either divine inspiration or a kind of human technology, a manufacture. Neither, for that matter, was the word creation in their theology or in their language. It's significant that the word for create, barach in Hebrew, does not exist in any other ancient language. The verb barach has only one noun that you can put with it, God. No matter how creative a man is, only God can create something out of nothing, materially. We cannot create matter out of nothing. But since we are made in the image of the Creator, we too are what Tolkien calls sub-creators. We create thought, we create fiction, we create art. Because the Greeks did not have the idea of creation out of nothing, they didn't have the idea of creativity in art. When the first biblical philosopher, Philo of Judea, went to Athens in the first century and studied at Plato's Academy and interacted with the Greek philosophers there, many of them thought that he was very wise because of his notion of God. There's only one God, he's supreme, he's perfect, he's eternal, he knows everything. Oh yeah, Plato came close to that too, and even in a sort of way Aristotle. But then, when he said, and this God created the entire material universe out of absolutely nothing, they thought, now we know you're insane. That's impossible. That's simply impossible. It's a radically new idea. And its image in the arts is a radically new aesthetic, which we have yet to catch up to. A real Christian aesthetic must be based on dogma, not on sociology or on ethics. The Jews were forbidden to make any image for worship because before the revelation of the threefold unity in which image and unimaginable are one, it was fatally easy to substitute the idol for the image. The Christian revelation set free all the images by showing that the true image subsisted within the Godhead itself. Well, that's a very short, single-sentence statement of an incredibly pregnant theological idea that will transform aesthetics. And she hasn't said by any means the last word about it, but she said the first word, and somebody should say a little more. If you're really ambitious, the person to read is von Balthasar, who's profound, but he's German, and therefore almost unreadable. Somebody said of Hegel, the most notoriously unreadable philosopher ever, somebody should first translate him into German. But to get profundity and clarity at the same time, you need somebody like C.S. Lewis, and that's remarkable. You don't usually get that. Well, I've given you 9 big ideas, and it's taken almost an hour, so I will now give myself the hook and give you time to ask questions.
You mentioned Sayers as an Inkling. Why is she often not listed as one of that company?
Oh, because she didn't usually attend their meetings. She was very friendly with all of them, and they admired her and thought very highly of her. And there was no falling out, but I'm not sure why. I don't think they were male chauvinists. She was the only woman who was part of the inner circle. But Lewis, Tolkien, and Charles Williams, while he lived, were the center of it. And then there were a few others like Dyson that attended most of the meetings, and she came occasionally. I'm not sure why. She was, by the way, very eccentric. She smoked cigars, she wore strange-looking clothes, and they loved her. I think the reason Lewis fell in love with Joy Davidman was that her personality was so similar to Dorothy Sayers. She was tough.
Please explain the sacramental view of work. I didn't quite understand it when you were talking about Sayers' critique of Rand's Fountainhead.
Sacramental view of work is basically to see work as a sacred thing. That is, to see secular work as sacred, to drill holes in the wall between the secular and the sacred. A sacrament, literally, is a means of grace. Work can be a means of grace. Instituted by Christ. Well, work has been instituted by the mind of God, who is Christ. Christ is in Genesis. And something that is not a mere sign, but also an effective sign, that which actually does what it points to. So it's both a thing that does work, a real cause, and also a sign of the thing that's being done. And work is that. What is work? Well, work is producing things, goods and services that weren't there before. So work is creative. But only by creative work do you become a creator. In that way, work actually produces the creativity that is in it. It, in a sense, creates itself. The opposite is the kind of Cartesian dualistic view of work. Here, you're a mind, a pure spirit, and you want knowledge, and you want pleasure, and you want all sorts of experiences, and you live in a physical world, so you want to transform that physical world into a world that will give you more knowledge, more power, more pleasure. So you, in your will and mind, command your body to do X work and bring A to B, because B brings you more pleasure than A. That's the non-sacramental view of work, the purely technical view of work.
I understand Sayre's chapter on finding a calling that each individual is designed for and can fully devote one's life. However, it still seems that many jobs in life just have to be done as a discipline, perhaps in learned enjoyment. Some children don't care for math or learning to play an instrument. Some homemakers would like to skip the ironing and the businessman meetings. Are the lines perhaps not always black and white?
Yes, but there is a fairly black and white line between natural work and unnatural work. Not all work is fun, not all work is easy. In fact, most work is not easy. And not all work is something that we all have an equal aptitude for. As you say, some kids don't like math. Most people don't like ironing. Most people find it rather boring to peel potatoes. But those are natural works, and they discipline the human spirit. And they're a kind of prayer. Remember, ora et labora, prayer and work, the two parts of life together. However, most work that most Americans do most of the time today is not a natural work. Studying math so that you can calculate what chemical reactions can best propel a rocket from a rocket launcher to take down an enemy plane. That's natural work. Because a plane is an extension of the bird-like nature or aspirations of a human spirit, and war is natural, although there's a lot of evil in it, and math is natural, nothing unnatural there. However, figuring out how you can, even in an ethical way, manage an economic takeover of another company simply so that you can make more money for whatever you want to use it for. There's nothing natural there. It's purely artificial. Insofar as the artificial is an extension of the natural or a servant of the natural, it participates in a natural work. Insofar as it exists for its own sake, it's alienated from it. That's probably the most important truth in Marxism. There's a lot of nonsense in Marxism, and Marx was a thoroughly confused and evil human being, but the critique of the alienation of the worker from his work in capitalist society is something that Sayers, following G.K. Chesterton and Belloc's distributism, took very seriously and agreed with. Now, what you can do about it, what's the solution? How to transform the system? Nobody's got a good answer to that. Distributism is a beautiful notion of back to nature, and small is beautiful, but how do you go from here to there, except in small groups? I don't know. I'm an economic idiot. I don't even balance my checkbook.
Contemporary culture imagines that it is pursuing pure creation or creativity and producing a great deal of ugliness. Is this ugliness art as creation or something else? How do we distinguish what is beautiful in art?
I don't think you can create ugliness. I think ugliness is a lack of creation. Just as moral evil is not a thing, it doesn't have an ontological substance as moral good does. So I don't think aesthetic ugliness has a kind of substance over here against aesthetic beauty over there, as if beauty is a white cloud and ugliness is a dark cloud. There is a beauty in so-called ugliness, dark clouds, and you need the dark to set off the light. But if you truly create it, then it's real, it's being, it has being, and all being has beauty.
Could you suggest ways to awaken our stony hearts to the wonder that is reality?
The Inklings.
To practical awareness, yes.
Yeah. Come to conferences like this.
That is the last question that was submitted via email. Someone have a question?
Can you speculate as to why so little of worth seems to have been written on the subject of Christian aesthetics?
Because I think largely of the sociological situation that we are in which the Christian community is very suspicious of aesthetes. They think they are inherently decadent and dissipated. There are two professions that, from the beginning apparently, from classical times, have been viewed with great suspicion by religious people and moralists. One of them is the theater. The other is lawyers. Even Shakespeare said, first we'll kill all the lawyers. Well, I don't want to get into that. Don't tempt me to tell some of my favorite lawyer jokes. But why has the theater and the arts been always viewed with suspicion? And why has there been this natural tension, if not alienation, between moral and religious people on the one hand and people devoted to beauty on the other hand? Well, I suppose it's partly because beauty is so profoundly interesting and powerful and almost magical. You have no defense against it. Somebody comes up with a really stupid and destructive idea. If you have any sort of a mind at all, you can combat it. Think of the idea as a soldier on a horse, and you're in a castle, and there's a drawbridge, and you let down the drawbridge for all friends but not enemies. And the soldier on the horse says, I am your friend. And you say, oh yeah, prove it. What's the password? And you argue with him. And you see that he's the enemy, so you don't let down the drawbridge. You don't believe that idea. Or a soldier on a horse comes in and says, I'm good for you. I can make you better. You should be like this. And you say, well, I have a thing called a conscience, and that's an aspect of my reason. I'll argue with you. And I'll use my conscience to evaluate you. And you might say, no, you don't let down the drawbridge. But somebody beautiful comes on a horse, and he's not on a horse. Where is he? He's in the rain. He falls down from the sky, and he fills the moat, and the moat overflows because there's so much rain there. And the overflow of the moat seeps under the walls of the castle, and you can do nothing about it. And that weakens the foundation, and the walls fall down, and the rain comes in. There is no defense against beauty. That's why we're afraid of it, but that's precisely why we have to cultivate it. What a profound power we have. You cannot resist beauty. Remember that story I told you about St. Patrick's Cathedral? The first truly beautiful thing that struck me. How can such a wicked and horrible thing called the Catholic Church, the whore of Babylon, be so beautiful? I told you what I'll tell these people. Three profound persons that I know, two of them philosophers, one of them a very pious and rather mystical Benedictine monk, have told me at various times in their lives, not copying from each other, that they were once atheists. And the argument that refuted their atheism and made it impossible for them to doubt that there was a God was the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. The most beautiful thing we've seen to connect these two alienated worlds now, the world of morality and the world of art, the most beautiful thing we've ever seen in this world is Jesus Christ. And The whole purpose of the church is to be a Christ-making machine, to make little Christ, to make saints, to turn us all into saints. And when you find somebody like Mother Teresa, you can't argue with her. You have to be very, very wicked to argue with Mother Teresa. I mean, Christopher Hitchens tries, but even he doesn't succeed. So the very reason why we've shied away from art is precisely the reason we should do exactly the opposite. It's power. Wasn't it Solzhenitsyn has said, if the world's going to be saved, it's going to be saved by beauty?
You spoke of Sayre's rebuttal of the postmodern notion that dogma in church is what keeps people away from church, and I think we all here can agree that it's the lack of dogma that's causing problems in the church. Can you expound on this?
I can, but I won't, because Sayre's already did. But if you want me to, I guess. It's not totally true what Sayers says. Don't take it literally as a law with no exceptions. If you preach dogma, you will bring in much of the world that you wouldn't bring in otherwise, but you'll alienate some people. We all have a dogma. But the dogma that some people have is, I hate dogma. They have a dogma against dogma. They have an intolerance of intolerance. So yes, you will piss people off very seriously, as Jesus did. If you want to bore everybody and produce smiles and make everybody a Canadian, well then don't have any dogma. Whenever I go to Canada, I test this hypothesis. I deliberately insult my Canadian hosts, who are always very nice, and they always thank me for insulting them. And they apologize for being so apologetic.
Any other questions for Dr. Kreeft on the Inklings or on philosophy?
A bit of a random rabbit hole, but you mentioned your distaste for a lot of Jesus fiction. Would you care to shed any commentary on the novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ?
Oh, that's not Jesus fiction. Jesus is a character there, but he's in the background. You see him through Ben-Hur's eyes, not through the author's eyes. So that works. That works very well. The contrast between that and the kind of thing Tim LaHaye or Frank Peretti puts out today is radical. Quo Vadis is another book where it's profoundly Christian, but Christ is, not there as a character. You don't see his face. Yeah, I should modify myself. I certainly didn't mean to say you can't write profoundly Christian fiction, or you can't write historical fiction about Christ's day. Theophilus is a very good book by Michael O'Brien, one of the best Catholic novelists in the world today, if not the best, and it's about one of the characters in the Gospel, Theophilus, Luke's friend. It works. It's good historical fiction. It's not a masterpiece, but it works. Something like that can be done, but you can't do with Jesus what you can do with anybody else. Unless you do something like Lewis did. Don't talk about Earth, talk about Narnia, and don't make him a man, make him a lion. So you creep past what he calls the watchful dragons of familiarity and duty that stifle your spontaneous response and say to you, this is what you ought to feel, and thus make it impossible to feel. So Lewis tricks you. It's a good trick. But you can't write, I don't think you can write successful Jesus fiction without some trick like that.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kreeft.